Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue our journey in his steps. Chapter 4, Part B. Sunday morning dawned again on Raymond, and Henry Maxwell's church was again crowded. Before the service began, Edward Norman drew the curious and thoughtful eyes of most of the congregation. He sat quietly in his usual place, about 3 seats from the pulpit. The Sunday morning issue of the News contained the statement of its discontinuance had been expressed in such remarkable language that every reader was struck by it. The events connected with the news were not all. People were eagerly talking about the strange things done during the week by Alexander Powers at the railway yards, and Milton Wright in his stores on the avenue. As the service began, there was an undercurrent of excitement in the pews. Henry Maxwell faced it all calmly. His prayers were filled with hope. His sermon was not so easy to describe. How would a minister preach to his people if he came before them after an entire week of asking himself, how would Jesus preach? It is certain that he did not preach as he had done 2 Sundays before. Tuesday of the past week he had stood by the grave of the dead stranger and said the words, "Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust." And still he was moved by the spirit of a deeper impulse than he could measure as he thought of his people and yearned for the power to preach adequately Christ's message when he was in the pulpit again. Now that Sunday had come and the people were there to hear, what would the Master tell them? He agonized over his preparation for them, and yet he knew he had not been able to fit his message into the ideal of the Christ. Nevertheless, no one in First Church could remember ever having heard such a sermon before. There was definite rebuke of the greed of wealth and the selfishness of fashion, 2 things that First Church had never heard rebuked. Yet there was also a love of his people that gathered new force as the sermon went on. When it was finished, there were those who were saying in their hearts, "The Spirit moved in that sermon." When Rachel Winslow rose to sing, this time after the sermon, at Henry Maxwell's request, Rachel's singing did not provoke a rustle of applause this morning. What deeper feeling carried the people's hearts into a reverent silence and tenderness of thought? Rachel was subtly different. Her consciousness of her own loveliness had always marred her singing for those who had the deepest spiritual feeling. It also prevented her from rendering certain kinds of music effectually. Today this vanity was all gone. There was no lack of power in her fine voice. The added elements were of humility and purity distinctly felt by the audience. Before the service closed, Mr. Maxwell asked those who had remained the week before to stay again for a few moments of consultation, and he also invited any others who were willing to make the pledge. When he was at liberty, he went to the lecture room. To his astonishment, it was almost full. This time a large portion of the young people had come, but among them were a few businessmen and officers of the church. As before, he asked them to pray with him, and as before, a distinct answer came from the presence of the Holy Spirit. The parishioners remained some time to ask questions and consult together. There was feeling of fellowship such as they had never known in their church membership. Mr. Norman's actions was well understood by them all, and he answered several questions. "What will be the probable result of your discontinuance of the Sunday paper?" asked Alexander Powers, who sat next to Norman. "I don't know yet. I presume it will result in a falling off of subscriptions and advertisements. I anticipate that." "Do you have any doubt about your action? I mean, do you regret it or fear it is not what Jesus would do?" asked Mr. Maxwell. "Not in the least. But I would like to ask for my own satisfaction if any of you here thinks Jesus would issue a Sunday morning paper." No one spoke for a minute. Then Jasper Chase said, "We seem to think alike on that, but I have been puzzled several times during the week to know just what he would do." "I have that trouble too," said Virginia Page. Everyone knew Virginia was wondering how she would succeed in keeping her promise in regard to her money. Our Lord never owned any property, nor had much money, There is nothing in his example to guide me in the use of mine. I am studying and praying. I think I see clearly a part of what he would do, but not all." "I could tell you what to do as part of it," said Rachel, turning her face towards Virginia. "That does not trouble me," replied Virginia with a slight smile. "What I am trying to discover is a principle that will come the nearest possible to his actions as it ought to influence the entire course of my life, so far as my wealth and its use are concerned." "That will take time," said the minister slowly. All the rest in the room were thinking hard about the same thing. Then Milton Wright told something of his experience. He was gradually working out a plan for his business relations with his employees, and it was opening up a new world to him and to them. After a few of the young men told of special attempts to answer the question, there was also general agreement over the fact that the application of the Christ spirit and practice to everyday life was a serious step. It required a knowledge of him and an insight into his motive that most of them did not yet possess. When they finally adjourned after a silent prayer, they went away discussing earnestly their difficulties and seeking light from one another. Rachel Winslow and Virginia Page went out together. Edward Norman and Milton Wright became so interested in their mutual conference that they had walked on past Norman's home and came back together. Jasper Chase and the president of the Endeavor Society stood talking earnestly in one corner of the room. Alexander Powers and Henry Maxwell remained even after the others were gone. "I want you to come down to the railway yard tomorrow and talk to the men," the superintendent said to his pastor. "Somehow I feel as if you could get nearer to them than anyone else just now." "I don't know about that, but I will come," replied Mr. Maxwell a little sadly. How was he fitted to stand before 200 or 300 working men and give them a message? Yet in the moment of his weakness, as he asked the question, he rebuked himself for it. What would Jesus do? That was the end of the discussion. The next morning, Henry Maxwell arrived at Mr. Power's office a few minutes before 12. The superintendent said, "Come upstairs and I'll show you what I've been trying to do." They went through the machine shops, climbing the long flight of stairs, and entered a large empty room. It had once been used by the company for a storeroom. "Since making that promise a week ago, I have had a good many thoughts," said the superintendent, "and among them is this. The company gives me the use of this room, and I am going to furnish it with tables and a coffee maker in the corner there where those steam pipes are. My plan is to provide a good place where the men can come up and eat their noon lunch, and give them 2 or 3 times a week the privilege of a 15-minute talk on some subject that will be a real help to them in their lives." Maxwell looked surprised and asked if the men would come for any such purpose. "Yes, they'll come. After all, I know the men pretty well. They are intelligent working men, but they are, as a whole, entirely removed from all church influence." I asked, what would Jesus do? And among other things, it seemed to me he would begin to act in some way to add more physical and spiritual comfort to the lives of these men. It is a very little thing, this room and what it represents, but I acted on the first impulse to do the first thing that appealed to my good sense, and I want to work out this idea. I want you to speak to these men when they arrive in a few minutes. I have asked them to come up and see this place, and I'll tell them something about it. Maxwell was ashamed to say how uneasy he felt at being asked to speak a few words to a group of machinists. How could he speak without notes? He shrank from the ordeal of confronting such a crowd, so different from the Sunday audiences with which he was familiar. There were a dozen long, crude benches and tables in the room. When the noon whistle sounded, the men poured upstairs from the machine shop below and seated themselves at the tables and began to eat their lunches. There were 300 of them. They had read the superintendent's notice, which he had posted up in various places, and came largely out of curiosity. It was easy to tell from the looks on their faces that they were favorably impressed. The room was large and airy, free of smoke and dust, and well warmed from the steam pipes. At 20 minutes to 1, Mr. Power spoke to them simply, like one who understands thoroughly the character of his audience. Then he introduced the Reverend Henry Maxwell, of the First Church, his pastor. Maxwell never forgot his feelings as he confronted that craggy-faced audience of working men. Like hundreds of other ministers, he had never spoken to any gathering except those made up of people of his own class. This was a strange world to him, and nothing but his new way of life could have given any impact to his message. He spoke on the subject of satisfaction with life, what caused it, what its real sources were. He had the great good sense on this. His first appearance, not to recognize the men as a class distinct from himself, he did not use the term working men, and did not say a word to suggest any difference between their lives and his own. The men were pleased. A good many of them shook hands with him before going back to their work, and the minister, telling it all to his wife when he reached home, said that he was surprised how much he enjoyed mingling with these earthly men. The day marked an important one in his Christian experience, more important than he knew. It was the beginning of a fellowship between him and the working world. It was the first plank laid down to help bridge the chasm between the church and labor in Raymond. Alexander Powers went back to his desk that afternoon much pleased with his plan and seeing much help in it for the men. He knew where he could get some good tables from an abandoned eating house at one of the stations down the road, and he saw how the coffee arrangement could be made a very attractive feature. The men had responded even better than he anticipated, and the whole thing could not help being of great benefit to them. He took up the routine of his work with a glow of satisfaction. After all, he said to himself, he wanted to do as Jesus would. It was nearly 4 o'clock when he opened one of the company's long envelopes, which he supposed contained orders for the purchasing of stores. He ran over the first page of typewritten matter in his usual quick, business-like manner before he saw that what he was reading was not intended for his office, but for the head of the freight department. He turned over a page mechanically, not meaning to read what was not addressed to him, but before he knew it, he was in possession of evidence that proved conclusively that the company was engaged in a systematic violation of the interstate commerce laws of the United States. It was a distinct and unequivocal breaking of the law, as if a private citizen should enter a house and rob it. The discrimination shown in rebates was in total contempt of all statutes. Under the laws of the state, it was also a distinct violation of certain provisions recently passed by the legislature to prevent railway trusts. There was no question that he had in his hands evidence sufficient to convict the company of willful, intelligent violation of the law of the commission and of the law of the state also. He dropped the papers on his desk as if they were poison, and instantly the question flashed across his mind, what would Jesus do? He tried to shut the question out. He tried to reason with himself by saying it was none of his business. He had known in a more or less definite way that such violations had been going on with nearly all the railroads. Indeed, such was known to most officers of the company. Owing to his place in the plant, however, he was not in a position to come in contact with the freight operation, and had regarded it as a matter that did not concern him. The papers now before him revealed the entire affair. Through carelessness, they had been addressed to him. What business was it of his? Yet if he saw a man entering his neighbor's house to steal, would it not be his duty to inform the officers of the law? Was the railway company such a different situation? Was it under a different rule of conduct so that it could rob the public and defy the law and be undisturbed because it was such a big organization? What would Jesus do? Then there was his family, of course. If he took any steps to inform the commission, it would mean the loss of his position. His wife and daughter had always enjoyed luxury and a good place in society. If he came out against lawlessness as a witness, it would drag him into the courts. His motive would be misunderstood. The whole thing would end in his disgrace and the loss of his position. Surely it was none of his business. He could easily get the papers back to the freight department, and no one would be the wiser. Let the inquiry go on. Let the law be defied. What was it to him? He would work out his plans for bettering the conditions just before him. What more could a man do in this railway business when there was so much going on anyway? that made it impossible to live by the Christian standard. But what would Jesus do if he knew the facts? That was the question that confronted Alexander Powers as the day wore into evening. The lights in the office had been turned on. The whir of the machines in the big shop continued until 6 o'clock. Then the whistle blew. The men dropped their tools, hurried to wash up, change their clothes, and head for home. Powers said to his clerks, "I'm not going just yet. I have some extra work tonight." At 7 o'clock, anyone who had looked into the superintendent's office would have seen an unusual sight. He was kneeling by his desk, his face buried in his hand. And that ends Chapter 4, Part B. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 5. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.